This is how to write an SAQ for the AP European History exam. Here's the big takeaway. Don't underestimate the difficulty of the SAQ. It can blindside you, and it's worth big points on the exam. Multiple viewings along with real practice will be necessary to truly acquire this skill. Let's take an SAQ overview. The SAQ is the first part of the free response questions of the AP Euro exam. It comes directly after the multiple choice part. You have 40 minutes to write the SAQ part. You're given 4 prompts. You answer 3 of those 4. The first 2 are not optional. You have to answer those. Then you get to choose between prompts 3 and 4. The prompts are from different time periods. Each SAQ has 3 parts to it. An A, a B, and a C, and you answer all 3 parts of each SAQ that you choose. So it basically looks like this. Each part, A, B, and C, of each of these 3 questions that you will answer is a point or no point proposition. So there's a total of 9 points available. 3 parts times 3 prompts. For each of the 9 total parts, you either get that point or you don't. Let's define 4 critical SAQ terms. These are the College Board's definitions right out of the course and exam description, or they're from the dictionary. And let's start with describe. College Board says provide the relevant characteristics of a specified topic. Description requires more than simply mentioning an isolated term. That comes from College Board. Explain. Provide information about how or why a historical development or process occurs, or how or why a relationship exists. And be very careful with that word information, because in my mind, information and evidence are the same thing. Claim. This comes from Merriam-Webster, an argument that's asserted in the face of possible contradiction. And then finally, evidence. Like I just said, information that can be used to support, modify, or refute a source's argument. And that is from College Board. This is the basic outline for how to answer an A, B, or C part of an SAQ prompt. And teachers like to use the word ACE, A-C-E. First part is answer the question. Make your answer contain a claim. Think about, at this point, thoughts and isms of the time and place that the prompt is referring to, the institutions that we've studied, the developments and the processes that we've studied. Your claim is really about the larger picture. Then you're going to cite specific evidence and examples. And like I said, in my mind, evidence and examples are the same thing. Now you want to drill down and go for names, places, innovations, and events. Finally, explain why that evidence, that example, proves the claim with phrases like, this is an example of, this shows that, this demonstrates that, this illustrates. One of the things I like to use for any free response question, but especially the SAQ, is my free response thinking map. On the left, I've got space where you can brainstorm the relevant isms that come from the time and place that the prompt refers to. On the right, I've got suggestions for institutions that you might want to think about that relate to those isms. And then in the middle, I've got a place to write down specifics like people, groups, achievements, innovations, not to mention places. And I've also got a list of lots and lots of verbs that you can use with regard to how you want to express your answer. Now that we've seen the basics, let's hear some tips from some experts. And let's think about what kinds of tips they have in common. That's very important. If they're all saying the same thing, then that's going to be particularly important. So let's start with Michael Morgan. This is the link to his YouTube video on how to write an SAQ. Now, if you've had a chance to watch that video, here is just a quick outline of some of the tips that I picked up that I thought were particularly important. Number 1, Don't underestimate the difficulty. The SAQs can blindside you. There's a history of students having a problem with these SAQs. Another really good tip that he had was write down the time that you started the SAQ at the beginning and use that time to pace yourself. Remember, you have 40 minutes. That comes out to about 13 minutes for each main prompt. Comes out to about 4 or so minutes for each of the A's, B's, and C's. Third tip, for each question, make a special note of the time and the place and then brainstorm the isms, institutions, processes that were prevalent in that time period. Then you can focus your mind on recalling evidence about those specific things. For example, in this video, Michael Morgan uses the example of 19th century Germany. If your question is about 19th century Germany, it's a good bet that the answer will center around imperialism or nationalism. And then you can start thinking of specifics like Bismarck, Realpolitik, the Franco-Prussian War, the Berlin Conference, etc. Fourth tip, answer the questions you know first, then go back and attempt the ones that you don't know or don't know as well. And fifth, be specific, but also dedicate sufficient writing to that E in ACE, writing how or why your evidence fits the question. Now let's hear from Mr. Jocz. This is the link to his How to Write an SAQ video. Here are the tips that he left that I thought were the most important. Number one, just like Michael Morgan said, answer all the questions. Don't leave any questions unanswered. By the way, let me just say, I have proctored these tests before, and I'm always shocked and dismayed to see students sitting there and passing the time waiting for the next section of the test. They're not thinking about an answer. They're not trying to brainstorm. You can tell they're just waiting. Don't do that. This is your time to make the very most of the work that you've been doing all year. Use all of that time. Second tip, answer the easiest questions first. That's exactly what we heard Michael Morgan say. Mr. Jocks' chart that shows the types of SAQs is not quite as specific to us in AP Euro. So here's a more accurate table based upon the 2018 and 2019 exams. The 2020 exam didn't have any SAQs on it. The real difference between this chart and Mr. Jocks' chart is the historical time frame. Notice that it's the same in both questions 1 and 2. It's historical developments or processes between the years 1600 and 2001. What that means in practical terms is there will be no Renaissance, no Reformation, no age of exploration and conquest anywhere in these two first SAQ prompts. And that might be a good thing because that was the earliest part of the year. So that may be the part that you have the most trouble remembering. And that goes for both questions 1 and 2. Now let's look at questions 3 and 4. You don't have to do both of those questions. You're only going to do one of those questions. They have no stimulus at all. It's the prompt and that's it. But look at the historical periods. Question 3 deals with historical developments or processes between the years 1450 and 1815. That's also periods 1 and 2. Question 4, however, deals with historical developments or processes between the years 1815 and 2001. That's periods 3 and 4. Another way you can look at it is that question 3 will come from the first semester, the fall semester, and question 4 will come from the spring semester, the second semester. Another tip that Mr. Jocz had was, once again, ACE, A-C-E. Answer the question, cite evidence, and then explain or expand on it, tying it back to the question. He says you need 2 to 4 content-rich sentences. Don't be vague, be specific and relevant. Don't leave the reader with any doubt that you deserve the point. A fifth thing I want to say about this particular video is this. There's a correction on the video's sample question. The phrasing on the SAQ is very unlikely to include the word briefly. It has not been in the last two exams. I would imagine that this is because it was costing students points. If you have the time, overkill is better than underkill. Also, Part B is very unlikely to ask for a second example of exactly what Part A asked. Part B will be a related but different question from Part A, and Part C will be likewise. Now let's hear from Stephanie George, and this is her YouTube link on how to write an SAQ. Let's watch it, and then I'll talk about the tips. Tips. Once again, we've got ACE. ACE is a unique strategy to the SAQ. A stands for answer the question with a claim. Reword the question into your claim. C stands for cite the evidence to show that you know what you're talking about with specific facts, names, events, people, places, innovations, achievements, etc. E stands for explain why that evidence proves that your claim was correct. This shows, this demonstrates, one example of, this is proven by, etc. More of her tips. Number one, separate your answers on the page by writing A, B, and C. Also, number two, don't be fuzzy. Be concrete and be specific. We've heard that from the other two teachers. Number three, stay within 2 to 5 sentences for each letter. Mr. Jocz said 2 to 4. Ms. George says 2 to 5. And this is because this is a timed activity. You've got 40 minutes to answer 9 letters, 9 parts. And so that's about 4 minutes per part. Also, keep in mind that you have to write within the box on the page. Anything outside that box is not going to be counted, and that box has 23 lines in it for writing. A fourth tip, don't waste time looking for the answer in the stimulus. That is a common misperception about stimulus-based tests. Stimuli are there to shape and define the question, not to give you the answer. It is not a seek and find situation. If anybody tells you, oh, this test isn't going to be hard, it's a stimulus-based test, and that means you look for the answers in the stimuli, don't listen to them. They do not know what they're talking about. Number 5, answer the questions that you know about first. And Michael Morgan said this also. Then come back to the ones that you find more challenging. And number 6, this is very important, practice, practice, practice. Now let's look at a real SAQ from a real AP Euro exam. And this is from the 2019 exam. And this was question 2, which means if you look back on the chart, that this has a primary source stimulus. And so what we see is we see this image. We see its source, where it came from, when it happened, France. We also see a translation of what the caption says. So question number 2 has 3 parts to it, and notice they all start the exact same way. Describe one way in which. So part A says, describe the one way in which the image expresses ideas popularized during the Enlightenment. Part B says, describe one way in which the image reflects the policies of the French Revolutionary government's radical phase. All the parts of that prompt are important. And part C says, describe one way in which the ideas in the image continued to influence European political thought after 1815. So notice the first thing you should see is the 3 different time periods. Part A deals with the Enlightenment. That was before the French Revolution. Part B deals with the French Revolution specifically with regard to its radical phase. And then Part C, it takes place after 1815 when the French Revolution and the Age of Napoleon are over. So let's take each part and go through the process of how you answer the question using ACE. So part A was describe one way in which the image expresses ideas popularized during the Enlightenment. And remember, A is for answer. with a claim. So you might just brainstorm some of the ideas that were popularized during the Enlightenment. Ideas such as science, reason, age of reason, empiricism, natural laws, deism, knowledge, education, questioning tradition, natural rights, anti-superstition, anti-church, anti-absolutism. So that's a good list. It's not everything, but it's a good list to go on. Remember, we don't need that much. And so we're going to kind of choose what we like the best. And let's say we like the science and reason thing. Keep in mind that the antithesis of all that, some of the things that the reverence for science and reason led to was anti-superstition, anti-church. Well, we might answer the first part of that this way. One way in which the image expresses Enlightenment ideas is the Enlightenment's emphasis on science and reason. Enlightenment philosophers encouraged people to use both to question traditional ways of thinking, especially religious ideas, which they considered superstitious and fanatical. So that's part A in our ACE, but we need to keep going. We're not quite done yet. C is for cite the evidence. I consider evidence and examples to be the same thing, so you might just brainstorm a few of these. Voltaire and deism, Montesquieu and the Persian letters, Diderot's encyclopedia. So remember, you only need one. If I'm using the Voltaire and deism one, I might say this. For example, Voltaire wrote a satirical account of a meditation in which he met the historical Jesus who told him that the Gospels were inaccurate. Or if I'm going with Montesquieu, I might say, for example, in his book, The Persian Letters, Montesquieu characterized the Pope as a magician who could make the king think that bread was not bread and wine was not wine. Or if I'm using Diderot's encyclopedia, I might say this. For example, Diderot's encyclopedia emphasized that knowledge was for everyone, and one of its articles jokingly characterized the Eucharist as cannibalism. Remember, you only need one. You don't need to generate this much evidence. E is for explain the connection between your evidence and the question. So I might say this. This explains why the scepter of reason in the image is shown to defeat and drive away the symbols of ignorance and fanaticism, two ideas that Enlightenment philosophers applied to the church. Part B, let's try that one. Describe one way in which the image reflects the policies of the French Revolutionary government's radical phase. So, A is for answer with a claim. So let's just brainstorm some French Revolutionary government policies. Dechristianization, the Reign of Terror, the War in the Vendée. How about war against Prussia and Austria? Temples of Reason, festivals of reason. Keep in mind, some of the things that you brainstorm can fit inside other things. That's very frequent. How about civil constitution of the clergy, loyalty oath for priests, the abolition of privilege? Now, we need to trim that list a little bit. We need to look more critically at our prompt and see if we're going outside the lines here. Because keep in mind, we're not just talking about the French Revolutionary government. We're talking about the French Revolutionary government's radical phase. And some of the policies that I listed don't actually belong to that phase. They came before. So we need to scratch some of the things we listed that don't come from the radical phase. Civil constitution of the clergy, loyalty oath for priests, abolition of privilege. All of these came before the radical phase. Of all of these, I think the one that fits the image best, the one that's most useful, is dechristianization. So I might answer with this. I might say, one way in which the image reflects policies of the French Revolutionary government's radical phase is the dechristianization movement, in which elements of the French government attempted to eliminate Christianity from French society. So in that part, I've answered the question. I still need to cite some evidence. So C is for cite the evidence. Remember, evidence and examples, same thing. So if I'm brainstorming some specific examples of de-Christianization, I might come up with this. Notre Dame was converted to a temple of reason, and they held a festival of reason right there in Notre Dame. I might also come up with the new French Republican calendar. So if I want to use the top one, I might say this. For example, the Cathedral of Notre Dame was converted into a temple of reason with a goddess of reason and statues of Enlightenment philosophers. Or if I want to cite the French Republican calendar, I might say, for example, the French Republic issued a new calendar which got rid of Christian religious observances and replaced them with holidays that honored science and the Republic. Remember, you only need one. You don't need two. E is for explain the connection between your evidence and the question. I might say something like this. This calendar shows how the French Republican government tried to promote policies to get rid of what they saw as ignorance. Let's look at the third one. Describe one way in which the ideas in the image continued to influence European political thought after 1815. A, once again, in ACE is for answer with a claim. So let's brainstorm some political thoughts that came around after 1815. You've got liberalism, republicanism, romanticism, feminism, socialism, nationalism, imperialism, conservatism, liberty, equality. Now you might want to trim your list because remember, we're not talking about any thoughts in the 19th century. We're talking about political thought. And so we might want to scratch romanticism. Yes, romanticism is closely connected to nationalism, but you're talking about a multi-step process and we might not have time for that. So which one do we like best? Let's go with republicanism. And so A, I'm going to answer the question by saying something like this. One way in which the ideas in the image continued to influence European political thought was through republicanism. Republicanism was a rejection of tradition expressed through such antiquated concepts as monarchy, hierarchy, and privilege. C is for cite the evidence. And so we're going to brainstorm a little bit of evidence. Some examples. Well, I can only come up really with the French Revolution of 1848. And guess what? I only need one. So I might cite that by saying this. For example, the French revolted against French King Louis Philippe. He resisted any kind of social reform or electoral reform in order to maintain the status quo. They replaced him with a republic and a president, Louis Napoleon. Remember, you only need one example. E is for explain the connection between your evidence and the question. So I might do that by writing this. The Revolution of 1848, with its abolition of old monarchical tradition, shows that ideas about liberty and equality expressed in the Enlightenment ideals of this image continued in France well into the 19th century. As a final review, let's hear from Lauren Koeller, and this is the link to her video on how to write an SAQ. I hope you got a lot of tips. I hope this prepares you well for the SAQ. Now you just have to practice, practice, practice.